You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 103, covering the week of January 8th through January 12th, 2018. Our first podcast of 2018. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, just want to remind you of all the usual housekeeping stuff. If you like this podcast, please share it around on social media. You can find us on social media on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, on Facebook at Abbeville Institute, and, of course, on YouTube at Abbeville Institute as well. Actually, it's Abbeville INST there. I think also on Twitter as well. And, of course, if you go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, you can give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell. And you'll get our daily dose of Dixie, Monday through Friday, and our weekly Week in Review email on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday. Also want to remind you that we have an event coming up in February. It's next month, not long from now, February 24th, 2018. We'll be in Charleston, North Charleston, South Carolina, talking about the attack on Confederate monuments. Our featured speaker is Ben Jones, better known as Cooter from the Dukes of Hazzard. That'll be our banquet speaker. But we have a lot of other great guests. All the information is available on our website. At the middle of the page, you'll see a little tab that says You're Invited. Click on that. You can sign up for it. It'll be a great time. So come on out to our event in February. And just want to remind you as well, if you do like this podcast and everything we do, please support the Abbeville Institute. You can go to abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you'll see our little button that says support, and you click on that, and there's memberships for individuals for as little as $3 a month or $5 a month. $3 a month if you're a student, $5 a month if you're not a student. You can help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. So go on out there and do that. We do appreciate your support. Help keep the lights on, help keep the podcast going, the website up, all of those things. So please consider a tax-deductible contribution. Okay, all of that said, we've had a great week at the Institute, first week back, and of course we had about 50 episodes last year, so this is the first episode of this year. We're looking forward to a great year at the Institute, and of course we started off our first week back with a number of interesting articles. 3 of them had to do with one theme and 2 with another. So the 3 articles that had to do with the theme of the North, and I actually mentioned this in our summer school this past year. Of course, our summer school this year will be in July again, so if you want to, I think it's the middle of July, July 14th, if my memory serves me correctly. Don't quote me on that entirely, but it'll be somewhere around there, so if you want to start making plans in July to go to our summer school, that is our featured event, or our number one event for the year, so think about doing that. But I spoke that, one thing we might need is an Institute of Northern Studies, because, of course, the problem is, I think, in America that the South is considered to be this strange specimen, this other that has to be put under a microscope. And really the other in American history was always the North, not the South. And so if we fully consider what the issues are in America, maybe we need an Institute of Northern Studies. And so 3 of the pieces this week had to do with the North. And one was a fairly positive assessment of the North and their relationship to the South. The other 2 were a negative appraisal of the North, one in the antebellum North, the other in the postbellum North. And then, of course, the other 2 pieces this week had to do with the South in legal history and frankly, the South's role in distorting the Constitution. And there's that. There's that part of Southern history that needs to be told, and I'll get into that in a minute. And it is something that I think people need to know about. The Southern tradition does not always have positives in it. We've mentioned that before. Every tradition has positives and negatives. And in this particular case, the South needs to be held accountable for its role in distorting the original Constitution. So I'll get into that in a second. But let's start with this idea of the North and what the North has done to history. And that's an important point to make. So this little piece published on Monday, The North Busy Rewriting History by Bernard Thursam. So this is actually a reprint of a 1946 pamphlet dedicated to the public schools of North Carolina. And this is something that people talked about even in the early 20th century, but how the North was going to rewrite history and distort it. And I'm going to read this to you because it's not long, but it's funny in a way that people, and even to this day, if you're asked someone, who are the first Englishmen in America, you might get the statement, the Pilgrims, which is completely wrong. It's not that people don't know that Virginia, Jamestown, 1607, it's that our vision of America has been distorted by the post-bellum writing of history. And this is not to say there are not a lot of good teachers out there and people who don't do that. They talk about, Virginia was the first permanent English colony in North America, and Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in North America. So it's not that they don't say that, but they don't often. It seems that because of our perception of things like Thanksgiving, our perception of things is distorted. So let me read this pamphlet, or the excerpt from this pamphlet. Quote, "There is a grave danger that our school children are learning much more about Massachusetts than about the Carolinas, and hearing more often of Northern leaders than of the splendid men who led the Southern hosts alike in peace and war. Not many years ago, the high school in an important South Carolina town devoted much time to the celebration of Lincoln's birthday, while Lee, Jackson, Hampton, and George Washington received no mention. You have all heard of Paul Revere's ride made famous by the skillful pen of a New England writer. He rode 7 miles out of Boston, ran into a squadron of British horsemen, and was back in a British dungeon before daybreak. But how many of you have ever heard of Jack Jewett's successful and daring ride of 40 miles from a wayside tavern to Charlottesville to warn Governor Thomas Jefferson and the legislature of the coming of a British squadron bent upon their capture? You have heard of the Boston Tea Party, but how many of you know of the Wilmington, North Carolina Tea Party of 1774? At Boston, they disguised themselves as Indians and under the cover of darkness threw tea overboard. At Wilmington, they did the same thing without disguise and in broad daylight. With the utter disregard of the facts, they blandly claimed that the Republic was founded at Plymouth Rock, while all informed persons know that Plymouth was 13 and a half years behind the times. And when its colony was reduced to a handful of half-starved immigrants on the bleak shores of Massachusetts, there was a prosperous colony of 2,000 people living along the James River on the sunlit skies of the South. The fact is that New England has been so busy writing history that it hasn't had time to make it, while the South has been so busy making history that it hasn't had time to write it." And so when you look at American history, this is something we've talked about in this podcast and on our website several times, when we say things like the South is America. And of course, Dr. Livingston, when we had our interview in episode 100, said, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. There are different Americas. You can't just say the South is America. But certainly, and he did say, certainly the first 80 years of American history, the South dominated America. This Jeffersonian view, this Southern view, dominated America. The South was America at that point. I think that the real American tradition, when people start talking about the original Constitution and things of that nature, they're really thinking about the South. And so I think that writing things like this and talking about how the North has gone about telling a different story of America is important. This is why maybe a Institute of Northern Studies would help illuminate what the North has done to American history, which is not always good. Certainly there are great Northerners. There are great Northern patriots. There were great Northerners who did a number of great things. There's no question about that. But this Jeffersonian vision of America, which is Southern, dominated America for most of antebellum American history, and even after that, you still had a Southern vision of America dominate for years, though, of course, by the middle of the 20th century, that began to change. And this is why we're living in the current climate we are. So I think that it's important to emphasize the early part of American history and how that Jeffersonian vision of what America would be and what it should be, particularly in regard to government, is important. And of course, the great things that Southerners did that should not be swept under the rug. People should understand that Southerners did a lot of great things throughout early American history and even into post-bellum history. That said, the piece on Wednesday, I'll get into the piece on Tuesday and Friday in a second. The piece on Wednesday, they took their stand in Dixie, written by John Marcourt, our resident scholar from Japan, talks about another number of Northerners who fought for the South. In fact, the very martial version of Dixie, Dixie to Arms, which is the same tune as the great anthem Dixie, but with different lyrics, was written by a Northerner, Albert Pike of Massachusetts. Advance the flag of Dixie. For Dixie's land we take our stand to live or die for Dixie and conquer peace for Dixie. So Pike was actually essentially an abolitionist. And he was an author, jurist, poet, philosopher. And this is a guy that decided to fight or serve for the South. He was actually the Indian agent for the Confederacy, helped recruit a number of Indian tribes to fight for the South. And, of course, we have to understand that the tribes in Oklahoma, many of them supported the South. And, in fact, this is one of the reasons why they were so abused after the war, during Reconstruction, because of their support for the South. And so we need to remember that a number of Southerners were not born in the South. Many were born in the North or born in foreign countries. He talks about Patrick Cleburne, for example. William Brown from Ireland. Southerners from France. Southerners from England. So not just Southerners from the North, but also Southerners from other countries. And if we remember how diverse the South actually was in that regard, you get a different perspective of the Southern cause. There were 5 generals, he said, from the North or overseas who died for Dixie. Robert Hopkins of Ohio, Richard Griffith of Pennsylvania, Clement Stevens of Connecticut, and Brigadier General Victor Girardly of France, and Archibald Gracie of New York. So these generals all died fighting for the South. There were also generals who played a pivotal part in furthering the cause of the Confederacy. The first was the Confederate Army's highest-ranking officer, General Sanford Cooper from New York. He was also a Northerner. There was a General Josiah Gorgas of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And, of course, he was making powder and other things. So you had these very important... Actually, Gorgas is often considered to be not just from Pennsylvania, but also Delaware. I mean, he worked at the DuPont powder mills. So that's a Delaware Confederate. And when I wrote my master's thesis on the southern state of Delaware, or at least southern support in Delaware for the war, and he was one of those individuals. And so there's a number of Northerners who fought for the South. Sometimes infamously, sometimes famously. The most infamous was Pemberton, who oversaw the evacuation of Vicksburg. But this is an important part of Confederate history that's often overlooked. You get the impression that nobody in the North supported the South. And this is simply not true. I've said on this podcast before, really, if you take the number of Northerners who opposed the Lincoln administration, 45% in 1864, and then you add that, of course, to the crushing majorities against the North and the South, it doesn't mean that not all Southerners supported the war. So you did have some dissent in the Confederacy, not as much as some would like you to believe, but you did have some dissent. But if you take all of that and add it all together, the fact is that Lincoln still had a minority of support in the entire, what used to be the United States in 1860. He only received 39% of the popular vote in 1860. So there still was a large section of the North that opposed the war. Maybe not outright supported the Confederacy, but certainly opposed the war. Why? Because they thought it was an unjust an immoral crusade against the South, against the original Constitution. And so that perspective is often overlooked. There's actually a book out, and I can't remember the title of the book, by a professor who teaches at Christopher Newport University, Jonathan C. White. And it talks about how this Northern vote in 1864, this Union Army vote, in 1864, that the Union Army voted in crushing majorities for Lincoln, is often distorted by the fact that a lot of Union soldiers either didn't vote or their vote was suppressed. Those who would have voted against Lincoln. And there was a tremendous amount of voter fraud. And we know this was going on. We know that soldiers were allowed to vote and move to areas where they could swing the election in favor of Lincoln. So you didn't have to vote in your district. You voted in the state. They just moved them to a different part of a different state to vote so they could actually swing the election in favor of the Lincoln administration or the Republicans. So there's a lot of things going on in 64 that are very dubious when it comes to how much support did Lincoln actually have? How much support did the war actually have? I think that's something that's often overlooked. And so it's important to understand that the North was not universally behind the Republican Party and the Lincoln administration. On the other hand, you had a piece that we ran on Thursday entitled The North and Hitler, and how many Northerners actually actively supported Adolf Hitler. And the piece is written by Michael Martin, and it talks about how you had a number of industrialists in particular. Henry Ford was a supporter of Hitler. Walter Teagle of Ohio, of Standard Oil fame, was also supporting Hitler. And Prescott Bush from Connecticut supported Hitler. But these are things that you don't often hear. In fact, nowadays it's that the South would have been sympathetic with the Nazi regime and, of course, Hitler. But this is simply not true. You look at how many Southerners fought in that war, and crushing majorities of Southerners. And it doesn't, of course, large numbers of Northerners fought in that war too, and fought heroically in that war. They're not great soldiers from the North. But the fact is, there were many Northern industrialists who were supporting the Nazi regime, perhaps not during the war, though maybe there might have been some clandestine activities going on, and I think Martin brings that up. In fact, Bush's activities were, some of his business dealings were seized. The Trading with the Enemy Act in 1942. So some of these things continued even during the war. So when you look at the North, the North often escapes critique in this process of re-examining its positions on various unsavory things in American history. Support of the Nazis, for example, or its role in slavery, or its role in segregation or race relations. All of these things that we find unsavory and, of course, are often pegged back to the South. When you really look at things, you'll find that the North was as much involved in these things as the South. But they get a free pass, and that's because of the treasury of counterfeit virtue. Because the North supposedly fought to end slavery, they escape the condemnation that the South gets painted with. Anytime you talk about quote-unquote white supremacy, it's often showed with the Confederate flag, regardless of the fact that that was the dominant position of the vast majority of Americans at the time. And so, even after the war. So, this is problematic. This is one thing that we need to understand, that the North should be held complicit in these quote-unquote unsavory things, these things that Americans now find unsavory. And, of course, slavery is an unsavory institution. And the resulting problems of race relations that created all kinds of problems for black Americans. Those are unsavory things, the way they were treated. But the North was as much complicit in those things as the South, and so they should not get a free pass. Now, let's talk about the other part of this week, which was the South's role in legal history of the United States. And the first piece on Tuesday was written by Zachary Garris, and it was a review of the great book, Government by Judiciary, by Raoul Berger. Raoul Berger was a legal historian, and he wrote this book in 1977. It was reprinted in 1997 by Liberty Fund. You can actually get it for free online. But it's a wonderful book because it talks about the 14th Amendment. The entire book is dedicated to an understanding of the 14th Amendment and what the original intent of the 14th Amendment was. Now, I discussed this in quite a bit of detail in my How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America. And the main culprit in this distortion of the 14th Amendment was a Southern Supreme Court justice named Hugo Black of Alabama. Now, Hugo Black was a progressive, and Hugo Black was interested in a different interpretation of the 14th Amendment because he saw, perhaps, the problems of Catholicism and what he thought were, Black wanted, for example, a separation of church and state through the First Amendment. He wanted to incorporate that amendment. He wanted to use that amendment against the states because he worried that somehow Catholic schools would be able to use state funds to advance their agenda. And so there was that part of it. And I think that's not too far. It's not a conspiracy theory. Black was certainly anti-Catholic. But this is a distortion of the 14th Amendment. People often say, well, yeah, the states can't do anything. They can't pass laws, for example, saying that we have to have prayer in school and these type of things, because the First Amendment prohibits that. Of course, that's a distortion of the meaning of the First Amendment. But they do this through the 14th Amendment. And that's a distortion of the intent of the 14th Amendment, as Raoul Berger expertly shows in this wonderful book, Government by Judiciary. So applying the Bill of Rights to the states, which was something that John Marshall said was not the case, I think John Marshall would know about that. And of course, the Supreme Court rejected that. Also, in the slaughterhouse cases in the 1870s, the problem is that we've had a court, really since the 1950s, that's been dedicated to expanding the meaning of the 14th Amendment. Berger goes back and looks at the debates of the 14th Amendment when it was ratified, and did it actually incorporate the Bill of Rights? Some of the Republicans, it's interesting, you go back and read those debates, some of them did say they believed that the Bill of Rights was already incorporated. I mean, and it was funny because at the time, one member of Congress stood up and said, yeah, did you ever read that John Marshall decision that said that wasn't the case? Oh, yeah. Well, we think John Marshall was wrong. Of course, John Marshall, being a member of the founding generation, this is the one time John Marshall did anything correctly as Supreme Court Chief Justice, and an understanding of the idea of incorporation. He said, that's hogwash. The Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. And if you look at the ratification of the Bill of Rights, if anyone thought it did, particularly in New England, this is, again, Northern Studies, it never would have been ratified because 3 states in New England actually had state-established churches supported by state tax dollars. And so if they thought that was going to remove the ability for those states to continue with their state-established churches, they never would have ratified the First Amendment. And so the issue with this, of course, comes down to segregation, and that's where people get very upset if you start talking about incorporation doesn't work. But Berger heroically said that the interpretation of the Supreme Court and Brown v. Board of Education was completely wrong. He said that, the segregation is an evil, and Berger was actually a liberal. He was a leftist at the time. He was not a segregationist. He said the segregation is wrong, and we can all agree with that today. The segregation was wrong. It was not for the federal government through the court system to deal with that. That should have been done through the states. That would have been the correct legal interpretation. And so this is something that would not be said today. So Berger pushing that position is doing something that would be completely alien to the modern legal profession. But that said, when you look at Southerners and the Southern interpretation of the Constitution, you have to go back to a very important Southern figure, and that would be St. George Tucker. In fact, there's a reason why Mel Bradford created the St. George Tucker Society, which has since been distorted and taken over. But the idea was to celebrate this great Southern jurist who was actually an abolitionist. But he was an originalist in that he believed the Constitution formed a compact between the states, that nothing had changed. And so we have a wonderful little piece by Joe Wolverton, Remembering St. George Tucker, published on Friday, talking about Tucker. We ran a couple of years ago. In fact, actually, I think it was the first year we relaunched the Abbeville Institute. We had a whole week dedicated to the Tuckers. Not just St. George Tucker, but John Randolph Tucker, Henry St. George Tucker. So we had a number of great little pieces on the Tucker family because they are an important part of American legal history, even into the 20th century. You had a very important member of the Tucker family in the Senate, real Jeffersonian in the Senate in the 1920s. And so that was a real American political dynasty, not just the Tuckers from Virginia, but also the Tuckers from South Carolina. And so understanding who the Tuckers were and why they were important is one of the things that we should all do in understanding what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. This is a true and valuable part of the Southern tradition, the views of the Tuckers when it comes to the Constitution and the understanding of the Constitution as a compact between the states, that the states ratified the document, that the Constitution did not change the nature of the Union from the Articles of Confederation. It gave the general government certainly more powers, but it did not alter the idea that what we had was a union of states, not of people. And Tucker's work on the Constitution, his treatise on the Constitution, published in 1803, View of the Constitution of the United States, was the first commentary on the document after it had been written and ratified. And so Tucker was a great legal mind. Of course, St. George Tucker was also John Randolph of Roanoke's stepfather. And that's an important part of the Tucker family as well. Understanding that Randolph, though Randolph and Tucker did not get along very well, but still part of this Tucker political dynasty, John Randolph of Roanoke. So we have in the Southern tradition, this Southern legal tradition, a very important part. Now, this is actually what attracted me to the South many, many moons ago when I was an undergraduate. It was this part of it, this Southern political tradition. I was, interested in conservative politics, but it didn't. As you start doing that, you go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and you start finding the South as the core of that, the bedrock of that, the Jeffersonian political tradition as part of that. And that's what attracted me to the South. My family was not born in the South. I was born in Virginia, but my family not being from the South, this is something that came to me through study. And I think that if you honestly go out and look at these things, this is what's going to happen to you eventually. You're going to get involved and start understanding the Southern political tradition, and legal tradition is the bedrock of American conservatism. Calhoun is more important in many ways than just about any other Northerner. Russell Kirk admired John C. Calhoun and did not think that Alexander Hamilton, for example, was a conservative. So you can't do that nowadays. So there was actually a great little book published by ISI, amazingly, by a man named Tucker, Garland Tucker, that talked about Calhoun as a great conservative hero. This came out just a little while ago. And of course, Clyde Wilson, my book with Clyde Wilson, Forgotten Conservatives in American History. Clyde wrote a wonderful chapter on Calhoun, and anyone who has a real honest mind when it comes to American conservatism has to include Calhoun. The neoconservatives don't like Calhoun, but if you are an honest conservative, you have to see Calhoun as part of the American conservative tradition. So all of that said, hope you enjoyed this podcast. We're back, and we'll be doing, of course, these weekly again for the remainder of the year. So until next time, good day.